All right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the webinar. People will be filtering in, but just as an introduction, today we are going to be discussing considerations for the right imaging platform for your practice. We'll be specifically looking at circumstances that could mean your practice has outgrown what is possible in Horos or any standalone viewer you might be using coming into this discussion. My name's Ari. I'm a solutions advisor at Purview, and we'll go into the difference between Purview and Horos in just a bit. I work closely with veterinarians looking to identify the right imaging platform for their practice's needs. A lot of the veterinarians I work with work in specialties that take them off-site or necessitate quick turnaround times for sharing and receiving their studies. So we thought it would be valuable to take some time to look at some of these situations and give some clear-cut answers as to what we can do in Horos and what might require maybe a step up. Joining us today is Jay McClelland, who oversees our customer support team. Jay's been with Purview for, I guess, over 7 years now. He's our resident Horos expert as well. So not only has he helped countless of our veterinarian clients who are using Horos, but has written extensively on it. You'll see some of that at the end of the presentation. So when customers outgrow Horos or experience any of its limitations, Jay usually hears this from the front lines and is able to identify solutions for them. So he'll be guiding us through some of these considerations today. Thanks for joining us, Jay.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Just a general housekeeping item before we start this. The conversation is being recorded. Microphones are muted. So if you have any questions during the conversation, you can type them in the general chat box. We'll also have a general Q&A near the end, so you can ask there. But we can get right into it. So for starters, a little overview on Horos. People coming into this may already be using Horos or using something similar to it, but Horos is a free open source software that makes medical image viewing accessible for millions of users across the globe. You see it on the screen here. There have been over 1 million Horos downloads from over 186 countries, so all over the globe. And in many industries, medical, research, pharmaceutical, IT, legal, and of course, most pertinent to today's discussion, the veterinary industry. Horos is also almost 10 years old. We're about to hit that benchmark. So we've been around for a while and continue to evolve to the veterinary market, medical market's needs. And I mentioned this a little earlier, the difference between Purview and Horos. So Purview is the chief sponsor of Horos. We keep it running, but all the changes and developments come from community collaboration. So any donations are greatly appreciated and they make a profound difference. So I thought it would be helpful for us to start looking at what Horos is great for and where we run into some potential limitations. So Horos, I should say, is a powerful diagnostic image viewing tool that, like I said, is used by many across the globe in a variety of industries, but there are pieces where Horos excels and some areas where we run into limitations. We wanted to highlight those here. So Jay, you field a lot of these types of inquiries from our Horos users, and you probably run into a lot of, can it do this, or should it do this types of questions. Could you give us maybe a primer on what Horos works for and where we run into some limitations?
Yeah, so just to cover some great things about Horos. As far as being a free DICOM viewer, I mean, it's really great. It's very powerful. It's great for local viewing. So if you have CDs, if you have share links where you get links to images, it's great for just local viewing. And like I said, because it's a free software, it's very powerful as well, and it's great.
Great. And then what about some of the instances where, I know we have some of them off to the right here, but some of the instances where Horos may not be the best fit for someone's practice?
Yeah, so it's great for local viewing, but then once you're starting to build your database and you're trying to increase the capacity of your data set, it then becomes problematic. And there's just certain limitations that Horos has as well. Trying to use it as like a PAC system as far as sharing records. being able to get other records, receive records into it as well. So it has limitations when you're trying to use it as like a pack system.
Sure. So it sounds like as a local viewing software, just on that machine, that's where it has its most benefits. But when you're trying to use it to share, to maximize storage, if you're working on a large database, that's where we could run into some issues. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Portability as well.
Right.
Because Horse is great for local viewing, it's not always fully portable.
Great. Okay. One of the other points here is the operating system. So just something worth mentioning, which we'll talk about again at the end, but Horos is specifically designed for the Mac operating system. So if we're looking at environments where there's multiple operating systems or it's predominantly Windows, that's a situation where might run into some limitations. However, like we'll mention a little later on, there is still a way to make Horos part of the equation. So we'll come back to that. So the first scenario that we wanted to look at here, and the way we're going to do it is kind of look at certain scenarios, certain situations where it makes sense to use Horos, maybe where it doesn't, where the specific limitations lie. The first one we wanted to look at is working offsite or on the go. And so you see some of the types of veterinarians that would find themselves in this situation. So in these situations, imaging is not just confined to the office. Maybe it's large animal veterinarians, maybe equine doctors, and they need to access their studies offsite with clients on the track, or they're simply doing a lot of field work, and so they're on the go. So there's lots of these situations where, like Jay mentioned, practitioners need mobility and portability. So Jay, looking at people who, or practitioners who are using Horos right now, is it possible to use it offsite or on the go?
It is possible. It just becomes a little bit more challenging because you have to consider your hard drive. If it's just your Mac or your laptop, um, you can obviously take that on the road and use that on the road. Um, but again, just being portable, it that has some issues as well as far as if it gets stolen, if it gets damaged, then your entire data set is lost, right? So, um, but yes, you could use Oros on the road, but again, there are some things to consider and
Sure.
take it into consideration. Yeah.
And like you mentioned, I mean, there's the potential that someone could bring an external hard drive or something like that. There could still be some protection there. It's not a completely foolproof system.
Right. It is definitely possible, but then when you bring like hard drives, you're gonna have to think about like the power outlet and things like
Mm,
that. So there's always like things to consider when you're trying to take things that aren't necessarily fully portable and trying to make it portable.
okay. And then what if we were to contrast that to a cloud-based system like Purview Image, which I should mention again at the end, we're going to talk about what Purview Image exactly is and how that contrasts to Horos. But if we were to look at that, Jay, how would that work in this type of situation?
So yeah, so because the database is essentially in the cloud, you don't have to worry about the database part of it or have a concern of like damaging your equipment or getting your equipment stolen where you're losing your entire records, right? So because it's in the cloud, you don't have to worry about the storage part of it. Um, and then it also allows you to um, just get the images to a local viewer like Horos, and then be able to upload and back them up whenever you get the internet connection or whenever uh, you know you find time to do that.
That brings up a good point. So you mentioned internet connection, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, if I have Horos offsite, or if I'm, traveling to a client site or something like that, I don't necessarily have to rely on the internet. Maybe when it comes to sharing, but just viewing the imaging, I've got all of it saved here locally. So if we're thinking about a cloud-based system that is relying on the internet, and let's say I'm in a rural area or I've not a lot of service, are there any issues that we run into there? Is it still possible to work with a cloud-based system?
It is. You'll still be able to send studies to the cloud. You'll still be able to retrieve studies if you ever need to look at a prior, things like that. So it is definitely possible still on a Wi-Fi coverage using on your laptop.
Okay. And then I mentioned this earlier, so maybe you can give us more information, but let's say that I love using Horos. I love the functionality and the display. I still want the cloud benefits of something like Purview Image. Is it possible to get both?
Yes, definitely. And we actually have and support a lot of clients out there, a lot of vets that do just exactly that. They still like using their Horos viewer because it is a like I said, for being a free software, it is very powerful and useful. So that's why our vets still like to use it. But then they feel safe having the cloud database where they can access and store their studies and don't have to worry about losing that.
Sure, absolutely. And so, like Jay is saying, I mean, the two are tied together. And since we are the chief sponsor of Horos, we've actually built it into Purview Image. It's a function of the application where you can open up an instance of Horos for the associated study. So the two will still work together, and you don't have to worry about completely losing Horos or getting used to a new viewer by any means. Below here, I should mention, we've highlighted two of the clients where working offsite or on the go was an important part of their transition to Purview Image. So to the left here, you see Racing Victoria. They're the principal racing authority in the South Australian state of Victoria. And so one of the things that they've done and where this really came into play was that they pioneered an equine limb injury prevention program. So they're doing imaging at the stable or the track before and after races. So lots of athletes, lots of remote stakeholders involved, and so they relied on Purview Image to review and share thousands of images a year. So that's one example of being on the go. The other to the right here, another equine example, is inside information radiology. Again, equine specific, but this is more focused on teleradiology. So they remotely collect and read images from their clients. And with over 200 referring vets internationally, they relied on Purview Image to continue working remotely without having to piece together their own solution. So basically putting all the IT work in the background. Those are two examples we thought would be helpful for this. So now we can look at a second scenario where we can compare and contrast Horos and a cloud-based system, which is sharing studies and reports. So when it comes to the specialty veterinarians we work with, thinking cardiologists, neurologists, orthopedic surgeons, and so forth, or our critical care veterinary clients, we know there's an immense need to facilitate the sharing and reporting of studies. So they're getting these studies back to their referring vets and pet parents with conclusive reporting, which not only gives the pet parents, in that example, peace of mind, but it's integral to scalability. Some of our specialty vet clients will tell us that having a refined process for sharing back to their referrers means more referrals in the future, which of course lets them scale the practice. And of course, it works in the other direction. Veterinarians who need to refer out and want to ensure they can get their imaging to a specialist in a timely and organized manner would prioritize something like this. So, Jay, looking at how sharing and reporting is done now with, say, Horos, how does that usually work?
So just Horos by itself, there isn't a great method of sharing. They would have to rely on, either burning the records onto a CD and doing it the old-fashioned way, or relying on some type of a sharing mechanism. I know there's like things like Dropbox. I believe Microsoft has like a cloud-based sharing drive. So they would have to kind of rely on a mechanism to kind of electronically share those records. Horos does have an optional cloud reporting and study share option. But again, that's just a additional cloud-like service that's similar to like a Dropbox. But that's another way that they could share the studies and the reports. But as a standalone application, it's not easy to share studies and reports from the Horos application directly.
Okay. What if, as a practitioner, I wanted to share over a medium like email? Would that be possible, or are there some considerations I should keep in mind?
Yeah, so with email, it's typically the problem you run into is the size, the memory size, how big of a file can that email server handle? And a lot of times with these DICOM image files, you're only going to be able to send like one or two image of an X-ray, right? You're not going to be able to send like a huge CT or an MRI scan. So that's becomes the problem using an email.
Okay. Okay. So it's mostly file size that we run into, and so
Right.
larger files are going to be difficult to transport. And then you mentioned this before, but with general cloud-based file sharing like Dropbox or the Microsoft one you alluded to, are there any risks or maybe not risks, but are there any issues with that that we should be aware of?
Not for the vet world. Um, other than it's yeah, in the vet world, I guess it could be used in that practice just for a sharing mechanism.
Sure. It's just a matter of tying together multiple systems at that point.
Right.
Yeah, and I can imagine as a practice grows, and maybe now you've got more modalities, you've got more veterinarians and people involved, it just becomes a lot more to handle where you've got your viewer, and then you've got how you share your files, and then maybe some of them have to go over CD since it takes so long. So it's maybe more of a logistical concern at that point.
Right. And then you're gonna have to create your, Dropbox account and then
Yep.
manage that as well. Yeah.
Sure, sure, absolutely. So if we were to contrast that, I mean, we're talking about general cloud sharing, but if we were to contrast that with more of a purpose-built cloud-based system where the viewer, the sharing, the storage is all together, like Purview Image, what would that look like? How would sharing and reporting work in that type of system?
So in that system, because it's a true PAC system, everything is centralized. So, sharing of studies electronically becomes very easy. It's a simple of just entering the recipient's email. Um, the Purview product also has where you can create a URL, so you could just put it into your own email. So it's not restricted by the size, it's just a clickable link. So sharing becomes very easy. There's also a reporting module within the Purview product so that you could actually do your reports, complete your reports, and then also share those along with the study. Um, so it because it's a purposeful PAC system, the sharing and completing your reports and sharing those reports becomes a lot streamlined and everything's centralized. You don't have to do multiple accounts or multiple apps. Um, so yeah, it just becomes a lot more streamlined.
Sure. And it brings up you brought up a good point too, where you mentioned the URLs, clickable links, where using something like Purview or any purpose-built cloud-based PAC system, your recipient is clicking that and, in theory, immediately opening the web viewer. They're looking at the imaging right away versus, again, to go back to the example of a general cloud-based sharing system, something like Dropbox, there is a reliance on having a viewer. So not only are you having to tie two pieces of software together on your end, but so is your recipient. So it's a good point. We made two examples here again to showcase where this actually worked in terms of some of the clients we work with who made this transition. So thinking specifically about specialist veterinarians, on the left here you see Vet Specialists Ireland, which was actually the first specialty-only private vet hospital in Ireland. When they were scaling their practice and started working with us back in 2016, they relied heavily on referrals. So it became a hindrance to not be able to quickly share their imaging and have their referrers be able to directly open the web viewer, like we just talked about. So Purview Image allowed them to do that at scale, The other example to the right is Dubai Camel Hospital, another first here. They're the world's first medical center focused exclusively on treating camels. And when they started working with us, again, looking at scalability, their demand saw that they actually had to grow to house, I believe it was 32 camels, at which point they started working with Purview Image so that their veterinarians could advise on cases from anywhere and simply send secure viewer links to their clients who could put the imaging in, and they would receive it. So made for, like Jay said, a much more convenient client experience. So we can look at our next example now, our next scenario, which is central storage and access. So for this, rather than focusing on certain types of veterinarians, this is really for anyone who wants to centralize their processes. In a growing practice, you might find yourself, like we talked about before, adding more scanners or diversifying the types of scanners and modalities in your office, or maybe you're adding more staff members and administrators. So you're housing your imaging on a variety of workstations. So thinking more generally here, let's say I'm your average veterinarian. I'm leading a practice that's growing fast, and I feel like I'm wasting time digging through emails and various workstations to find my studies, and I just want a central repository where I can store, organize, and locate my studies. So, Jay, with Horos, what would my options be to centralize those processes?
Well, because Horos relies on a local database, it's literally that MacBook or the Mac, unless you have a hard drive. If you have like a external hard drive or a RAID, that could be like your centralized location, so to speak. But again, it's very limited as far as it has to be local. You've got to be right there to be able to access it, unless you're using remote accessing programs. Um, everything's kind of localized.
Sure, sure. I see what you're saying. So we can add things on like an external hard disk drive or RAID array, and we can increase storage capacity, but we're still, everything's on that machine. So all the processes that we want to combine have to be on that local machine. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And adding more modalities, you're going to add more machines to that RAID or to that just one localized system.
Okay. And so if we were to compare that with a cloud-based system like Purview Image, what does centralizing our storage and our access look like there?
So in that scenario, we're using the cloud as the centralized place. So the number of modalities, however modalities that you get, you can all set them up to send to that location, which is helpful for like referring type of situations, or any clinic or any site that's actually off-site that wants to upload to that location. So it becomes a powerful way to upload all your studies to a centralized location. So you're not limited by the physical location itself, whereas the other scenario you kind of are.
Got it. I see what you're saying. So when we have the cloud rather than your local workstation as that centralized place, it doesn't matter how many, well, in theory, it doesn't matter how many modalities you add, how many staff members, it's going into the cloud. So you can manage all of those with this one process rather than having to maybe add extra workstations or add extra accounts.
Correct. The physical barriers are kind of removed.
Right, right, okay. And we've got two examples of that again here. So a familiar face to the left, Vet Specialist Ireland, like I mentioned before. But another part of their process when they were moving to working with Purview Image was that they wanted to automatically upload their studies from their modalities, like Jay was mentioning, having extra modalities and wanting to be able to manage all of that. And that's where having the cloud as the central storage was beneficial and was part of their move to working with us. And to the right here, you see Anavet, which is a French veterinary hospital. They're actually one of the only options in their region that offers specialty imaging to household pets. So again, we saw a lot of referrals and wanting to centralize their processes. They were primarily using CDs to hold and share their studies. So when they started working with Purview Image, they began using our uploader, basically a remote uploader link that lets their clients upload, share their studies through there, and that let them centralize the process. So the next scenario, and I think this is the final scenario that we're going to look at here, is backup and recovery. And so we're going to end this one with more of a heartwarming story. But before we go into that, this is another topic with applicability to any veterinary practice of any size. So we're not saying that this is for certain types of veterinarians. Really, any practice can afford to focus on backup and recovery. And as the footnote here mentions, most jurisdictions actually require veterinarians to save studies for a certain long-term period. That could be 6 to 10 years, depending. So, Jay, let's say that I'm storing all of my imaging in Horos right now. So I'm storing all of it locally. What have you seen happen when clients take an approach like that?
I've sadly, I've seen some people lose their entire data set, all their studies. If you don't make a backup of what's your database and you lose that database, then all that data becomes compromised. So yeah, so that's the worst I've seen. And then there are some other cases where, they might damage their laptop, they might drop it or something, and then they've got to do, recovery of data services. So they eventually get their data back, but of course they've got to pay for, a service to recover that data. So it can be bad.
Yeah, no
um,
kidding.
Especially if these are important records and they're really trying to maintain the history and the accuracy of this. Yeah, it becomes a liability.
Sure. And it sounds similar to what you mentioned before when we talked about working off-site, where there's that physical risk that if you're just working off that one machine, any damage or anything that gets lost, it was there. It wasn't backed up anywhere, so you lose all of that.
Right. Yeah. Unless you're doing a good job of doing like a backup of your data, then yeah, it becomes a risk.
Absolutely. And if we were to contrast that with a cloud-based system like Purview Image, what would that look like when it comes to backup and recovery?
So because it's cloud-based, you really don't have to worry about that. That almost becomes alleviated and it doesn't even really become a risk. You can have your laptop, you can have it stolen, you can drop it and break it, and you're still gonna have all your data that's still stored in the cloud.
Great. And so that ties pretty well into this heartwarming story that I alluded to. This is AgWest that, if we look back in 2021, there was a historic storm in British Columbia that culminated in this 100 years flood that led to lots of devastation in terms of lives lost, and physical damage, and then of course catastrophic damage to data for anyone with who hadn't backed anything up in the cloud or was keeping their on-site storage in a place that was prone to any damage. So AgWest, which has been our client since 2016, so fortunately 5 years before this incident, they specialize in bovine and equine medical services. They had one of their two locations right on the mainland where this occurred, but fortunately their data was backed up in the cloud through Purview. They were able to continue their practice largely unaffected. So we thought that would be a nice story to see what the flip side of this looks like. Yes, there's the potential for lots of damage when there's not proper backup, but the flip side of that is that when it is properly backed up, you can really avoid catastrophe. So to round this out, we can look at a summary of comparing Horos to Purview Image, just so we can look at this a little bit more holistically here. So we'll summarize some of the key differences, but it is important to note again that Horos is a well-respected diagnostic viewing tool. Like Jay mentioned, it's a very powerful tool. So think of these points less as downsides to Horos and more as considerations for when it's time to graduate to another tool, which in this case, like we mentioned, lets you continue to use Horos. So they're not completely distinct. So when it comes to DICOM, both Horos and Purview Image follow the DICOM standard. They're specific to radiographic medical imaging. When we look at resource requirements, Horos only works on the Mac operating system, whereas Purview Image works on the Windows and Mac operating system. And in addition to that, works on whichever browser you'd like, since it's browser-based and nothing has to be installed. When it comes to local access, with Horos, users can access imaging only from the specific device that it was captured with and stored on. So with Purview Image, in contrast, we're using a central cloud repository, so users can gain access on any device simply by logging into the system. And then finally, DICOM send and receive, maybe not quite as relevant to all of the veterinary practices we work with, but it's worth noting that with Horos, routing DICOM from one device to another is possible only from the local machine with that unique connection versus Purview Image. Again, we're using the central cloud, so a DICOM send can be completed regardless of which machine you're working on. So to go to maybe some questions here, we have just a little bit of time, but we can address a couple questions. Jay, if you wouldn't mind, let's think about, as a veterinarian, if I were to start using Purview Image, will Purview set up my modalities to automatically upload to the cloud?
Yes, we can do that. So that basically anytime you do a scan, it just gets backed up and stored into the cloud.
Okay, gotcha. And then thinking about having IT support needed, if we're maintaining Purview Image or any sort of cloud-based system, what sort of IT staff or IT support would be needed on the client's end?
On the client's end, not too much. And Purview will help you get you set up and to make sure that your modalities are connected, that your modalities are automatically uploading the studies. So there isn't too much needed from an IT point of view. The only thing that sometimes we do need to get involved are the modality technicians. For example, if you have like a GE CT scanner, a lot of times those are locked down to the actual GE technicians themselves.
Hmm,
So they'll actually have to put in like the DICOM address and things like that. But besides that, they're not going to really need too much from an IT point of view.
sure. Okay. And then I guess just another question here would be when it comes to, let's say I'm very comfortable using Horos. I know how to use the viewer itself. I'm not quite as familiar with using a PAX or a tool that facilitates sharing and storage. Is there any training that would be provided if someone were to move to Purview Image for the staff on how to use it?
Yes, absolutely. We provide, an onboard and initial training to all of our clients just to make sure they're, um, using the system, that they're okay with using the system, that everything makes sense to them. A lot of things that we develop is kind of intuitive in nature, but of course, we always want our clients to kind of feel happy about the decision that they made and that they're able to use it in their workflow and getting their job done.
Absolutely. Well, great. Jay, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time and your help here. Um, just got one more screen to show you all in terms of what's next. And I mentioned this before, but the Horos project is driven entirely by community changes and development. So if you wanted to donate to the project, it really does go a long way. We also have a GitHub community and a Google group for those contributing to its development. And we're on social media, where we keep our followers up to date of upcoming events, webinars like this, blogs, and other resources like white papers that we come out with. So be sure to follow our Instagram. And then we also have a YouTube for some of the videos that we put out. And then finally, two of our top articles here that you can check out on our blogs page. The first one written by Jay, and that's on the top 10 Horos tips so that you can get the most out of Horos. It can be a very helpful tool if you're using Horos today. And then one of our most downloaded articles underneath that is Horos versus Purview Image. So kind of what we just spoke about here, looking at the difference between the two, in a little bit more detail than we did. But thank you all for joining us. It's been great, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.